So without further ado, I give you the chairman of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, Matt Rose.
All right. I want to thank Bill Lipinski for that great introduction. I also want to thank Bill Costello. Both these guys were great leaders in the Congress in terms of infrastructure for our country. And I see we're joined by the Congressman Lipinski, and he's going to follow in those footsteps. So your theme today is private money for public infrastructure. I'm going to turn that inside out a little bit and talk a little bit about public money for private infrastructure in terms of how we look at these rail assets because they are private. I'm going to talk for a few minutes and then try and move along to get to questions and comments if you have. I've been asked to give the railroad perspective of PPPs, and it is a little bit different. But I think we all have to start with just understanding the importance of infrastructure in general. And Bill Costello did a great job of laying out, all the various studies that are out there, and they all point to one thing, and that is the inadequate level of infrastructure of what we currently have today. Bill Costello mentioned I did serve on a national commission that looked at the infrastructure for our country, and our voice has tried to be around making sure that we have a national vision of what the infrastructure needs are going to be, and that we have proper capacity planning to make sure that whatever dollars we have, and I think we all can agree that they're going to be limited in the future, that we're using those to the specific, the best and highest use of those dollars. That's really why the conversation that we're having today, this is kind of like preaching to the choir. Everybody in here is about infrastructure, but it's going to be important in terms of how we communicate that out to other people. And finally, PPPs, I do believe, are a part of that. So let me start by defining how the rail industry defines a PPP, the rail industry. But first I'm going to tell you how Matt Rose defines a PPP, and that is when we announce a $4.1 billion capital plan, the whole public should stand up and applaud. Because really, every dollar that we put into our private railroad is a dollar that at some point in time won't have to be put into the public pay system, the highway system. And I know that people really don't think like that, and I admit I'm a little jaded in my thinking, but that's really how, if you were in charge of this whole country, you might look at it a little bit different. The rail industry sees PPPs as truly a strategic collaboration between a private entity and a public sector in pursuit of an outcome that benefits both parties. These collaborations generally involve a cost-sharing component where each party pays for the benefits that they derive from the project. The public pays for the public benefit, and the private industry pays for the private benefit. Of course, that's where all the tension is making sure that we get these splits correct. In many cases, a PPP helps to unlock the benefits for both parties that otherwise would remain trapped, since neither party could not by themselves justify the investment. The private sector shouldn't be asked to replace public capital in the construction of public infrastructure. Likewise, public funding shouldn't replace private capital. We believe that by fairly sharing costs in these projects, we create opportunities to increase the number of rail projects which contain significant public benefits. So our definition looks like the CREATE project right here in the city of Chicago. The freight portion of CREATE is now fully funded, thanks in large part to the private sector, but also to IDOT, who really stepped up and helped fund a very large portion of these projects. And while I know that the passenger part is still in the works and not fully funded, we've already seen benefits from the many grade separation projects. An example of this is Route 59, fully funded from 12 different sources, both public and private. That project's already realized significant benefits. There's other examples as well. The Alameda Corridor in Southern California, Tower 55 in Fort Worth, Texas, and there's a new intermodal facility that had some public money right outside of Kansas City. There's also some projects that, quite frankly, that the PPP does not fit our definition. In many cases, these PPPs end up being arrangements where the public infrastructure is sold or leased to a private entity in order to generate capital for the public sector. That capital may or may not be used to build more transportation projects. Sometimes it's used to fill budget shortfalls that don't have anything to do with transportation. Bill Costello gave us that warning in his remarks as well. We think it makes best sense for the public component of infrastructure investments to be financed by revenues that are user-derived, meaning that those who benefit from the infrastructure will pay for it to build more and to maintain it. All that being said, we do support PPPs. They're a part of the mix, but they are to supplement traditional funding. As I mentioned before, we believe solely that there needs to be a robust user-based system. We've said it many times, I think the gas tax is the best way in the near term to pay for the system, and that means, yes, raising the gas tax. Under the status quo revenue streams getting into the Highway Trust Fund, the CBO projects a cumulative trust fund shortfall of about $80 billion through the year 2020, assuming future spending levels plus inflation that are consistent with those recently enacted in MAP 21 bill. The true deficit would have been much higher if it had not been for the transfers from the general revenues into the Highway Trust Fund that have occurred over the past years and will occur again in 2013 and 2014 under MAP 21. All in, since about 2008, the Highway Trust Fund will have received about $50 billion in general fund money. Many recognize that this is not sustainable funding, a sustainable funding situation, or, more importantly, good public policy over the long term. Lots of states are asking for change, but most don't want to pay for it. Some states are beginning to see that raising the gas tax could be a good option, and are also discussing a number of alternatives such as congestion pricing, vehicle miles traveled taxes, and even increases in the state sales tax, which is the downside of moving away from the user-based model. Right, wrong, or indifferent, the states will decide what works best to fund their own infrastructure, but we still have the challenge of finding a sustainable funding source at the federal level. So what are the other challenges? Beyond the question of infrastructure funding, we also need a focused national freight strategy to ensure that our limited federal dollars are being invested where they deliver the most return for the nation's freight supply chain. MAP 21 did call for putting some thought behind this concept, and BNSF has already participated at DOT in a DOT working group meeting to help them think through the best approaches. One key investment focus must be what we call intermodal connectors. As the Building America's Future recent report reminds us, think back on the nation's transportation history. President Lincoln focused us on the transcontinental railroads starting in the mid-1800s, followed by Teddy Roosevelt's efforts to improve the waterways for commercial traffic, and the Eisenhower highway system. So what's the next logical step in our nation's strategic transportation progression? At least part of the answer is completing the process begun by these various leaders, investing in the needed infrastructure that efficiently ties all of these modes together, again, intermodal connectors. Investing in the many congested transportation metropolitan areas where these modes intersect in order to ensure a seamless, efficient, and globally competitive supply chain. And while these infrastructure investments will be critically important to handle the anticipated future growth, it's also important to recognize that the public investment will be needed, and in many places around the country is all being called for mitigation for the various community impacts from increased freight and passenger transportation volumes. An example of this in the rail industry would be along the dense corridors with a significant number of at-grade highway crossings. Federal programs such as FHWA's Section 130 grade crossing separation and improvement programs already exist to help address this challenge, but it's not funded at significant levels, and various freight programs aimed at mitigating these impacts have been proposed but not enacted. These community impacts could pose future challenge to increasing volumes across all modes of transportation. In summary, when we think about the gift of infrastructure that we've been given by our parents and our grandparents, we need to have the will to maintain and to expand this gift. We need to, when we look at the path going forward, there's not just one answer. First, we do need a national freight policy. There's also tremendous value to investing in mitigating the impacts of freight mobility. It's appropriate to, because while local markets benefit from freight movements, the national economy does too, and these projects ought to include freight rail. Second, we need to streamline the project authority and delivery process that you hear so many war stories about. Third, we need more funding of the transportation investment at all levels. we need to raise user fees, especially the gas tax, and increase the use of tolling and congestion-based pricing. And finally, we need to continue to fund PPPs where public benefits line up with the private investment and private with the private investment. Thank you. If we've got a few minutes, Bill, I'd be more than happy to take some questions.
This is your opportunity to ask a CEO some questions. Paul, you have any questions? No, you don't. Amy, you have any questions? There's a gentleman up there.
Hi, Matt. Gas tax last year, I think state and local governments raised about $37 billion for roads, including what they got from the gas tax, which really only supports the federal aid highway system, and they spent $155 billion. So is there a way to, obviously we're really out of alignment on user fees versus using property taxes and other kind. What do you do besides raise the gas tax to cover some of that?
Yep. So when we move away from the gas tax, and long term we need to, because cars are becoming more fuel efficient, we want that as a society. Fuel mileage will go up, gas tax revenues will go down. That's good for emissions and everything else. The problem is we've got to keep with a user-based system. That really takes you down into a VMT, vehicle miles system of some sort. When you move away from a user-based system, like is being proposed in some states, Virginia, the governor just came out and said that they should eliminate the state gas tax and replace it with a sales tax. You're no longer going to be pricing transportation properly. And the problem is that we, as public policy, we as educators, we as people running private industries, have done a really lousy job of explaining to the American public how we pay for these roads and how we pay for the maintenance. If you do polling, you would literally get some people to say, yep, I pay income taxes and that's how my road maintenance is paid for. In reality, we all know that that's not the case. The problem, of course, is that we also, as society, have done a lousy job of communicating, and we haven't done a very good job sometimes of using the public funds appropriately. We still have lots of states in this country that use their gas tax revenues on other things other than infrastructure. And as long as we do that, or as long as we fund things that are not of national significance, I'm sure that neither of the three congressmen ever would have done that, but as long as we do that, in some cases, then we're going to be subject to the American public saying, I'm not ever going to allow you to raise my gas taxes because you guys don't handle it properly. So it's a big challenge, but I think it starts with a communication program to explain to people. We didn't pay for this national highway system. Our parents and grandparents paid for it. We're simply maintaining it, and we're doing a lousy job. We are underpricing transportation tremendously in this country today. And we've got to get the communication and understanding of how that should look.
Another question?
Hi, Matt. David Stone with the Boston Consulting Group. We've got a question for you. As we've just heard from the congressman, federal government's becoming much tougher to get anything passed. So what can private companies, along with local and state governments, do most effectively to try and push forward an answer to this national infrastructure problem?
Yeah, so if you took a poll by state DOT leaders, and we have one here at least, and said, do you want to devolve the entire national program? There's be a lot of people say, yeah, let's just devolve it. We don't need it. Let's just let states worry about this themselves. They can raise sales taxes, they can raise license tag fees, whatever you want. The problem is, there was a reason that President Eisenhower laid out a vision for a national infrastructure, national highway system. And as much as it was for the passenger, it was critical for freight. And, that's where people don't understand the importance strategically of this interstate highway system. And when you move away from that and you allow, if you do believe in a devolution strategy, and you allow these states to erect whatever barriers at the state line, whether it be lack of infrastructure funding or taxation or whatever, it would impact greatly the competitiveness of the American workforce. I mean, about 40% of our GDP now comes from trade, worldwide trade. And this national highway infrastructure is vital to that. And so I think the first thing that's got to be done is that anybody who cares about supply chain, and everybody in this room does, but every business that ships products cares about supply chain in this country. They are the ones that ought to be leading the charge to renew this infrastructure and to make sure that we have funding sources for these things. So I'll put it back to my friends at Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, Target, Sears, every company that's out there, electric utilities, ag shippers, all the stuff that is handled on the surface of the railroad network and on the highway system. So it's really vital that there is a call to action because it's something that we know is such a competitive weapon for our country.
One last question.
How big of a challenge do you see with railroad bridges, and where do you see PPPs fitting into that?
A little bit. You know, I'll give you an example. We just replaced a railroad bridge last year at Burlington, and there was a little bit of PPP because there was actually a highway bridge on it as well. But we're going to, through our profits, pay for these railroad bridges. In that case, it was a $150 million bridge. We've got 7,000 bridges on our railroad, and it's, you know, when I look at highway bridges, I know exactly what's going on. They are wearing out, and so we have a very thoughtful program that looks at the smaller bridges that we replace every year, and then about every other year you'll see us pop out about $100 to $150 million new bridge. It's just the way these things are. The railroad and the highway, they wear out with tons, which is a good thing, but you've got to have enough money set aside in our own private fund to be able to do that. So the majority of it will be through private funding, which is what we did last week when we announced our $4 billion capital fund. About $180 million of that will go to bridges. Thank you all very much.
Well, I think so far you've had two excellent presentations here this morning, and I am quite confident that excuse me, it will continue. One thing I'd like to say to the former Congressman Costello and the present Congressman Lipinski, excuse me, I'm having a tough time saying it. You fellows should work as hard as possible to increase that gas tax. Because, you know, the more money that comes out of the general fund, the less influence the members of the T&I committee have on what is done with that money. So I strongly recommend that even though you're no longer there, Jerry, you should counsel people that you meet that serve on that committee that increase that gas tax. And I'm sure that Congressman Lipinski is getting the message over there also. Our next speaker will be a person who I really, frankly, don't know very well whatsoever, but the present congressman of the 3rd District does. He's dealt with her quite a bit. And a fellow who used to work for me. It is now a big-time lobbyist and consultant in Washington, D.C., a fellow by the name of Jason Ty, who was supposed to be here today, but he sent me a message telling me that something came up and he couldn't make his flight. The truth of the matter is that Jason Ty hasn't flown on a plane in 15 years because he doesn't have the courage to do so. But that's really the only area that he lacks courage in. Our next speaker is the Illinois Secretary of Transportation, who I know is doing an outstanding job underneath very, very difficult circumstances. because of the lack of funding, not only on the federal level, but in state government also. Ann Schneider. Ann?
Well, good morning, and I have to tell you, it's truly an honor for me to be here today and to take part in this symposium that Congressman Lipinski put on. And Congressman Costello, I was here and I heard your remarks, and I heard you talk about the new Mississippi River Bridge. I'm a big Cubs fan, so that Stan Musial thing, I'm not so sure about. Sorry. And the current Congressman Lipinski, we do have a good working relationship, and I appreciate that he is our senior member on the T&I committee in Congress. Luckily, this session, we've got 2 additional freshman members from Illinois that will be serving on that committee, who I'm sure will be turning to Congressman Lipinski for counsel and advice on how to manage those roles and bring back more for the state of Illinois, and we're grateful for that. So the topic today is public-private partnerships, and the state of Illinois is now seriously, really for the first time, taking a look at public-private partnerships to aid us in constructing our transportation infrastructure projects. And there's some reasons why we're now looking at this more closely here in Illinois. First and foremost, in my mind, is that Governor Quinn is committed to expanding Illinois' economic viability and our global competitiveness. And he also recognizes that the key to both is the state's transportation system. And when I talk about system, I'm not just talking about highways, I'm also talking about railroads, I'm talking about airports, I'm talking about our transit systems and our waterways too. The governor also knows that we have limited resources when compared to the need, and I think you heard that aptly described here today. Just so you know, we recently did a needs document for the state of Illinois on what it would take here in Illinois to build a world-class transportation system. And although we're not done with that analysis, we're already up to about $90 billion. Doesn't fit well into what we have available to us. So the governor has directed that we consider all means available to us to deliver that world-class transportation system, and we're going to do so with our sister transportation agencies. We're working closely with the Tollway, the RTA, and the CTA, Metra Pace here in northeastern Illinois, our downstate transit providers, Amtrak, the Class 1 railroads. I meet with them every quarter. Oh, and speaking of the Class 1 railroads, you guys should know, I know there's a number of you here today, and also our Amtrak partners. AASHTO somehow bestowed upon me the honor of being the new standing committee chair for rail transportation, and that was announced on Friday, so I'm going to be a pest to you going forward here, just so you know that. Another reason that we're looking at public-private partnerships is that, like it or not, and you've heard them talked about today, Congress has determined that there will be no more earmarks, which in the past were key to building large priority projects. Without federal assistance provided through earmarks, the state is not in a good position to take on large projects outside of the Tollway's $12 billion Move Illinois program. I want you to think about what our annual program is. Usually on average, we run about $1.5 billion in our annual pay-as-you-go program, and that's without any state bonded program, which currently we're blessed with the governor's Illinois Jobs Now program, which has helped to increase that amount, but typically $1.5 billion. When you look at large transportation projects that are being done here in Illinois, you think about Elgin O'Hare Western Access, the new Mississippi River Bridge in East St. Louis, and the CREATE project. Those all started because there were earmarks to help get those projects off the ground. And in the case of the new Mississippi River Bridge in East St. Louis to St. Louis, it's actually being built and hopefully will be open in 2014. We're excited about that. Without those earmarks, we're not able to do those kinds of projects. And I want to make sure that we thank the former Congressman Lipinski and Congressman Costello for their work in getting those things, and Congressman Hastert, Speaker Hastert, and his efforts, and also the current Congressman Lipinski and Senator Dick Durbin for their efforts in getting the earmarks for those projects that I just talked about brought home to Illinois. Another thing that is influencing our decision in exploring public-private partnerships at the state level is the expansion of the federal TIFIA program under MAP 21. MAP 21 has created an incentive for the states to seriously consider public-private partnerships. Under MAP 21, in federal fiscal year 13, there is $750 million in TIFIA funds, and in 2014, there will be $1 billion in federal TIFIA dollars. Since MAP 21 did not increase funding levels over Safety Lou, The funds added to TIFIA would most likely have flowed through formula funds in the absence of TIFIA. Based on Illinois' share of those formula dollars, that would have meant around $60 million more per year in formula dollars for this state, which for our 6-year program would have been $360 million. So in order to maintain our state's share of those federal dollars, we really need to seriously consider TIFIA financing and pursue it when appropriate. And another note, we did a TIFIA conference at IDOT last week where we looked at TIFIA and we had the FHWA come in and talk to us about it. The interest rates now offered on TIFIA loans are currently just over 3%, and that's very competitive with our state GO bond and debt service. And since TIFIA favors projects that have some private participation, the PPPs are even more important as an alternative financing model for the state. And finally, recognizing that public-private partnerships provide a valuable alternate model for financing transportation projects, in 2011, the Illinois General Assembly, and I see Senator Resin here, thank you, Senator. In 2011, the General Assembly passed a law allowing IDOT to pursue public-private partnerships. And in 2010, the year before, we received specific authority to pursue a public-private partnership in conjunction with the Ileana Expressway project. It is important to remember that though the public-private partnerships do not result in new project resources, it is a viable alternative to financing. Public-private partnerships are a financing mechanism, and the state will still need to identify funds for the repayment of that financing. And to repeat, the capital generated from private finance must be paid back with commitments of long-term revenue to repay lenders and private investors. We also know that public-private partnerships are not for every project. There will be careful analysis done to determine the appropriateness and viability on a project-by-project basis. Each project needs to be analyzed to determine the viability of using a public-private partnership, the repayment mechanism or mechanisms, preliminary design and cost estimates, and a value for money analysis. When considering the use of public-private partnerships, and this might get too deep into the weeds here, it's important to first recognize that many potential combinations of public-private partnerships are available. There's the design-build model, and that's where the public owner is responsible for project financing and funding, but the design-build partner has the ability to speed up a project and identify efficiencies through engineering and innovative construction practices. There's also a design-build, operate, maintain model, where the partner is responsible for operating the new asset and maintaining at a level that's agreed to with the public provider. That's in addition to the design and construction of the facility. And then there's the last category of public-private partnerships, and it includes design-build finance and design-build finance, operate, and maintain models, where the private partners provide part of the financing to deliver the project. In a public-private partnership, project financing can include private capital, private equity, TIFIA loans, private activity bonds, and of course the public owner funding. Given that there are just a few ways to repay the financing provided by the private partner, or the combination of private financing, private activity bonds, private equity, and TIFIA loans, careful financial analyses need to be done. Repayment of project financing can come from tolling, availability payments, and some form of value capture. Availability payments, where the government is actually paying the private partner for the ability to use that asset, can come from the public owner's own revenues, from tolling if the public owner chooses to retain the tolling rights, and from value capture. And value capture is where it's like a TIF district where you can capture the increase in property values and increase in sales and capture that through the taxes on property and on sales. There could also be a combination of those three different things. The decision of whether or not to pursue a public-private partnership will be guided in large part by the value for money analysis that compares the financial impacts of a public-private partnership project against the impacts of a traditional public delivery alternative. The public sector comparison will analyze life cycle cost, and it should be done when the public-private partnership alternative includes long-term maintenance. The relevant cost of the public owner also needs to be adjusted for risk and risk transfer. And there's a huge discussion on risk and risk transfer. FHWA has some good information, I think, on their website if you're wanting to dive deeper into the details, and I'm sure you'll hear about it later today on some of the other panels. Part of the analysis, and I think this is really important because I really didn't see this anywhere when I looked at public-private partnerships, but part of the analysis is to consider the value of inflation savings if a project is funded now versus some point in the future when you've got to wait to build up the ability to do so at the public sector level. For instance, if IDOT were to pursue a public-private partnership to replace the currently functionally obsolete I-74 bridge over the Mississippi River in the Quad Cities, we would be able to save approximately $175 million just by moving construction up from 2018 to 2020 to 2014. That's a huge savings. We need to consider that. Also, in many public-private partnership packages, they can be structured so that no payments have to be made until the construction is complete, and current projects could then continue, and there would be additional inflation savings realized on those current projects. Now, where does this all come down to here for Illinois? The department is preparing to pursue all financing options now available, including public-private partnerships. IDOT, in partnership with the Indiana DOT, is evaluating the use of a public-private partnership on the Ileana Expressway project. Preliminary financial analyses are underway, and once the initial analyses are done, a determination can be made on whether to pursue a public-private partnership. We are hoping for that decision really, truly at the end of this week. And our goal would be to conduct an industry forum this spring to gather input to a potential public-private partnership RFQ and subsequent RFP. IDOT is also interviewing candidates that bid on our RFP to provide technical, financial, and legal assistance for the Ileana public-private partnership procurement. All those P's are hard to say. Should we pursue that financing option? We anticipate executing that contract and putting the winning vendor to work as quickly as possible once we make a decision on whether to pursue a public-private partnership. Again, I hope that's in the next week. We are also in the process of scoring proposals to provide the department financial counsel to aid the department in evaluating other potential public-private partnerships. TIFIA will be considered in conjunction with public-private partnerships, or even perhaps separately as part of project financing. One of the potential benefits using TIFIA include that its debt is subordinate to the private financing, which allows the repayments to flow to the private side before flowing back to US DOT. And that helps to reduce risk for that private investor, and it drives down our interest cost as the public provider. It's also important to note that an investment grade rating is required, but it's done on the project itself. So I know you've recently read about the state's downgrade in its credit rating. Going through a public-private partnership and using TIFIA, it would be the project that would be rated for the investment purposes. Projects that we are considering for potential public-private partnerships include not only the Ileana Expressway, as I mentioned, but also the I-74 bridge in the Quad Cities, and any new or expanded capacity projects that could include a managed lane concept like HOT, HOV, or even some type of congestion pricing. Additional major river crossings, those are very expensive for us. The bridge in the Quad Cities would cost us around $700 or $800 million, and that's just Illinois' share. That doesn't include Iowa's share. So those are very costly projects, and I think Congressman Costello knows how expensive those are because he brought home that one in the Metro East. We would also be looking at public-private partnerships for interstate reconstruction projects, airport projects, and rail or transit projects that IDOT might be involved with. We talked about CREATE earlier. CREATE's honestly a very critical project, not only for the region here, but for the state and for, as you heard, the nation. And so we're looking for creative solutions to plug that last $2 billion hole we have there. Other related projects that could benefit from public-private partnerships include sorely needed improvements in the state's ports and other waterway improvements needed for efficient freight movement. And I think you heard Matt talk about freight movement, and freight movement is really critical to the Illinois economy. And we have a very rich multimodal transportation system here with all of the connections in place to make that system even more viable going forward and providing more economic opportunity for the people that live here. In the end, IDOT's goals for its public-private partnership program include, one, a programmatic approach where we look at the best delivery method for each project. So we're going to do that analysis. We want to make sure that it's the right approach. We want a transparent process so everybody knows what's being done, when it's being done, and how it's being done. We want a competitive process. We want to get the best price or the best value, honestly, for what we're doing. We also want a program that recognizes the importance of the state's DBEs, recognizes the importance of a workforce that reflects the rich diversity of the state, the importance of Illinois labor and collective bargaining agreements, and the importance of Illinois-based contractors and consultants. And I know there's a lot of the Illinois-based consultants here in the audience today, so we definitely want to make sure we take care of them. But in the end, the bottom line is we want a process that ensures the best value for the state and its taxpayers. And that's what we're going to pursue at the Department of Transportation. In the face of the growing imbalance between our user revenues, which I think we heard talked about, and our transportation system needs, alternative financing mechanisms are growing in importance. And I know that Matt talked about the motor fuel tax, but I think one thing to consider when you're looking at the motor fuel tax is that the new CAFE standards will actually increase vehicle mileage per gallon up to, I think it's 54 miles per gallon by 2025. If that's the case, we're going to see usage, or we're going to see that usage driven down some more, and that's going to create challenges even if the gas tax is raised. So I think there needs to include somewhere along the way a broader discussion about how we finance our transportation system through user fees. Anyway, I'm happy to be here today to move this discussion forward for Illinois, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Questions? Go ahead.
What decision is IDOT looking at making over the next few days on Q3?
We're looking at the financial analyses to see if it makes more sense for the tollway to take on that project, honestly, than for IDOT to take on that project. And it's taking into consideration all of those value for money analyses that I talked about. So we're hopeful that in the next few days we're going to see a decision. At that point, then we'll move aggressively forward one way or the other.
Right here.
Morning. I thought the first few speakers seemed to put a lot of emphasis on the need for increases in federal funding to solve a lot of the transportation problems, which was striking to me because I think when you look at the numbers, federal gas tax is more than enough to pay for maintaining the interstate system. The real needs are at the state and local level for more funding to do predominantly state and local projects, and that sort of seemed to be more your focus. And I'm wondering what you think about, is the solution to the unmet transportation needs primarily a state thing or primarily a federal thing, or?
It's a combination of everything, honestly. 67% of our funding in Illinois for our highway system comes from the federal government. And that is not just for the interstate highways. That includes federal aid highways, and it also includes some money that also flows to the local system. So I think it needs to be a combined solution, but it's really important for us that our colleagues in Congress really get to work on the next surface transportation bill, at the same time realizing that the Highway Trust Fund is being challenged and that there needs to be something done to figure out that imbalance between what is being raised and what the need really is out there for the uses.
Right there.
The PREA 209 standards is, as you mentioned, they're changing, and we have been working very closely with Amtrak on how we're going to implement that. We're actually in negotiations with them right now on what that will mean for the state of Illinois. But as a side part of what we're doing there, we're trying to work with Amtrak to develop creative ways to plug some of that operating subsidy that is going to be needed above what we already provide. So we're working closely with them. We appreciate the service that they provide for the state, and we see them as a key partner in what we do. So I think working together, we'll figure out the best path forward. We are trying to find ways to minimize the impact.
Congressman Lipinski.
I hear rumor that there could be a new capital bill, state level
question. Actually, the governor is very interested in pursuing a new capital bill this spring session. I know he's been in talks with the legislative leaders about that capital bill, so they'll be working to identify a revenue stream to support that capital bill. But I think recognizing that there is a significant need out there, he is very committed to transportation is a key component of our economy here. He's going to be working with them going forward to try and find a solution and to develop a program. We have, as I mentioned, developed a needs document that I have forwarded on. I'm sure they're not going to fund our entire $90 billion ask, which would, by the way, pay for the rest of CREATE. So we're waiting to see what works out between the leaders.
Secretary, thank you very, very much for your appearance here today. I thank you very much personally for being here, and I thought your presentation was excellent. So things are going extremely well at the present time. Now, I'm sure the next speaker, who is filling in for the former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, will continue the excellent presentations. And I'm not biased or prejudiced at all when I introduce to you, without a doubt, the second best congressman in the history of Illinois to ever represent the 3rd Congressional District, Daniel William Lipinski. I have to say, in all honesty, his mother, Rosemary, and I could not be more proud of him. The microphone is yours, Daniel.
Oh, that's all the introduction I get.
I said you were the second best congressman ever to represent the 3rd Congressional District.
I'm just not going to leave this. I'm just going to leave that one go. Yeah, I was asked last night about 8 p.m. over a turkey dinner that my wife and I made for our family if I would fill in for Denny Hastert, who was unable to make it here because of the weather. He's up in Wisconsin. So I said, sure, I'll just need a couple minutes to throw this all together. But fortunately, I had before me, I know Matt had just left, but Matt and Ann Schneider did a great job talking about public-private partnerships. I like Ann not just because she's a Cubs fan, which so when she was walking, we were walking the door at the same time. I noticed her Cubs purse, and I made sure I pointed out how I liked the purse. I have to say though that I don't have a problem with the Stan Musial Bridge. Well, the only problem I have is it was supposed to be the Jerry Costello Bridge, but as he just said to me, he couldn't really compete with Stan Musial. But I have to say I've learned from my father that Stan Musial was the greatest Polish-American baseball player ever. So even though he played for the Cardinals, I still like Stan Musial. CREATE, as Matt was talking about, Matt is a CEO. He's one of the most publicly minded CEOs, I believe, heading BNSF. I think that's very important, especially when you're talking about rail, which is a real public-private partnership to begin with, because of the importance. Rail is private, but the importance of it for moving freight and also for passenger rail. And CREATE, Matt talked about CREATE. I don't have to go into that. I don't think I have to tell anyone anymore about CREATE. But as I've said before, since my father is the father of CREATE, I consider CREATE my brother. And there's no project that's more deserving of funding than CREATE. We just have to make sure we get a few more grade separations done, because that's what I hear from my constituent constantly is about the trains blocking the way, and I experience myself, so everyone knows that's a big issue here. But CREATE's moving forward, and I just want to talk a little bit more in general about public-private partnerships. as we head into this next, as we start this next Congress. MAP 21, the reauthorization that we did last year, the much too short reauthorization, we went through a lot of, well, you know everything that we went through with that, all the extensions that that took. In the end, there wasn't as much done on P3s as some people were hoping for, were expecting. The biggest things were the putting more money into TIFIA. Ann talked a lot about TIFIA and what it is. And what we did was in 2012, there was $122 million for TIFIA. MAP 21 made it $750 million for 2013 and $1 billion for 2014. And so that was really the biggest thing in MAP 21 in regard to public-private partnerships. Tolling was also an issue. There was a lot of debate over tolling. And in general, what happened in MAP 21 was any interstate highway right now, you can add toll lanes to it, but you cannot take away lanes right now that are not tolled. And that was one of the biggest things, though, say, okay, if you're going to add a new lane, you can toll that. There's going to be issues of tolling and what else is done with tolling, what the federal government is going to do in regards to tolling, how much help the federal government is going to give towards toll lanes. That will also be part of what we're discussing as we talk about the reauthorization of MAP 21. There were a few other things in there that were basically trying to set the table for more P3s. There's going to be standardized P3 contracts that the Department of Transportation is going to develop. Going to come up with best practices in P3s. And also there's going to be, it also set up for centers of excellence on P3s. And also development of model contracts, things like that, sort of set up where the Department of Transportation, USDOT is setting up sort of where we can go from here for P3s. So as we head into this Congress, as you know, MAP 21 expires at the end of September of next year. Hopefully we will get moving quickly on that bill. A couple of things, like I said, tolling will be any more help, federal help in terms of tolling. Will roads built for tolling, that will be part of the discussion. One thing that did not happen is PAB's private activity bonds. There's a lot of talk about raising the cap on those. That was not done. That's something else I think will be under consideration. But we've got to figure out some way, and Jerry Costello did a great job talking about how all of us, all of you have to get out there and talk about what's going on in our crumbling infrastructure, and there just does not seem to be a real push to do anything about it. And there's a lot of people who talk about it, but I really have not seen a lot of leadership to get much done. So where are we at as we head into, we start this new Congress? Well, first of all, we have a new chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, Bill Schuster. Now, Bill Schuster, for the last year and a half, I've been telling Bill Schuster, because it was pretty clear as we got into the last Congress that Bill Schuster is most likely to be the next chairman of the T&I committee. And since Chairman Micah was terminated out, it appeared that Bill would be the next chairman. So all I would say to him over and over and over again was, Bill, when you get to be chairman of the committee, I hope you're like your father when he was chairman of the committee. Bill's father, Bud, as I've heard many times, used that committee as leverage against his party leadership. It was also used as leverage at times against the administration. But when you bring the committee together, unfortunately the committee's a little smaller. He was 75. It's a little smaller now, but you still have a big number of votes. You have a lot of leverage if you are willing to use that. But what that requires is being bipartisan on the committee. Everyone knows in the end the majority gets more and more of what it wants, but this committee has a history of being very bipartisan. It broke down to a large extent in the last Congress. I think Bill Schuster wants to try to bring that back. And certainly at the beginning of this Congress, he has shown a lot of signs of doing that. He has reached out to Democrats, and I expect it to be a more bipartisan committee again in this Congress. Doesn't mean things are going to be easy, doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, but I think that we can get more done because of that. Now, the chairman of the Highway and Transit Subcommittee is Tom Petri, which absolutely shocked me because Tom Petri was the only Republican to vote against the bill, the reauthorization bill that came out of committee last year. Now, I was very happy, and I think that shows a lot about who Tom Petri is, that he was willing to stand up after our 18-hour marathon markup. It was a lot of fun. I'm sure, I know you're glad you don't have to go through those anymore. I remember leaving the room and thinking, I think Petri voted against that, but it was so foggy after 18 hours, it was like 3 in the morning, and I had to go back and check, and he did vote against it. That shows that Tom is someone who, believes what he believes, and he's willing to take a stand. I think he's going to be a very good chair of the of that subcommittee. Now, on the Democratic side, Nick Rahal from West Virginia continues on as the ranking member of the full committee. Now, Peter DeFazio is the chairman of the Highway and Transit Subcommittee. Now, what we're all looking at, because that's what we as politicians do, and we all are looking at, does Nick Rahal run for the Senate in West Virginia? Since Rockefeller is retiring, he seems to be the leading candidate for that. But even more, that wouldn't have any impact this Congress. But the possibility this Congress is that Peter DeFazio, if Ed Markey wins the Senate seat in Massachusetts, Peter DeFazio will be the top Democrat remaining on the Resources Committee, in which case he is likely to leave, although it's nothing certain, but he could leave the Highway and Transit Subcommittee as ranking member and go over and be the ranking member of the full committee on resources. So those are the things that we are always all looking at as then where the merry-go-round goes from there. But it'll be interesting to see, and it won't be until June that will happen. So it's possible we could have a new chairman, a new ranking member, of the Highway and Transit Subcommittee by the time we really get to work on the reauthorization of MAP 21. Now, of course, it all comes down to funding, as everyone has said. Bill Schuster has come out and publicly said we should have on the table the gas tax, and we should have the VMT. And when he was asked this, he said gas tax, VMT, tolling, and P3s as ways that we're going to finance this bill. I'm very happy to see that the chairman has actually been willing, has had the guts to actually say the gas tax is on the table, because that we have not had a lot of leadership willing to say that, and the VMT also. But I tell you, it is going to be all very hard to do this. It is, we see, it is, was mentioned, Matt Rose mentioned, states are moving away from the gas tax, are looking at it at least. Bob McDonnell in Virginia, who may be looking at running for president, right now he wants to eliminate the 17.3 cent per gallon tax in Virginia, gas tax, and replace it with a 0.8% increase in the sales tax in the state of Virginia. And as someone pointed out to me, he's hoping that no one notices that this actually is going to cost the taxpayers more money. It's going to bring in more funding, which then he will be able to have a big transportation bill for the state. But it's a way of masking, with a gas tax. It just shows how unpopular the gas tax is when someone could look at eliminating it and replacing it with a increase in the sales tax. We don't have such an option at the federal level, and anything still at this time, even after we went through what we went through and there was a lot of easing up and income tax rates went up for some people with the fiscal cliff deal, taxes, raising any taxes is extremely difficult, especially if it can be portrayed as raising taxes on the middle class. And that's, very clearly this administration, at least in its first term, was squarely against that. I wish I could end on a positive note here. It is very difficult to see where we are going to get the money from. But there's always hope that there can be some change, figuring out some way, somewhere, that we can get that money. And I think we are in a better position today than we were in 2 years ago because we have a chairman of the committee who is willing to put all options on the table. And that makes a big difference as to where we could possibly go and where we might be able to get the funding from. Now, the most important thing is earmarks. I don't think they're coming back anytime soon. As Ann said, she pointed out how some of these projects really got their start with earmarks. The Stan Musial Bridge, Jerry Costello Bridge, started with the earmark really got it going. The earmark that I got, CREATE, was the first funding for CREATE. I'm unapologetically in favor of earmarks. Tell you, Bill Schuster privately last year kept telling me he was hopeful earmarks would come back this Congress, and I asked him a couple weeks ago, and his hope has really waned a lot. I think it's very difficult right now to see earmarks coming back in this Congress, although I think there is more of a mood going back in that direction. They won't be called earmarks. They'll be done differently somehow, but I don't think it's going to happen right now. So the big thing for us to look for is the setting up as things start. For P3s, is what's the discussion going to be as we move forward to the reauthorization of MAP 21. And like I said, I expect there can be other issues that we are working on. Rail and water infrastructure are going to take center stage at the beginning of this Congress. But I think that we're going to need by the middle of this year to really start moving on MAP 21. So with that, I'm going to open up for any questions that you have.
Dan, you were a professor prior to becoming a congressman, so you could recognize all these students out there that want to ask questions.
Okay. Yes. I figured I'd talk about politics, and you all want to hear about the politics, right?
So I just wondering, you and Ann both mentioned how earmarks were kind of necessary to get big projects rolling. And it seemed like the total pot of money is the same, so what is it about earmarks that made that possible?
Well, one thing that we had in Safety Loop in the previous highway and transit funding bill was mega projects of national and regional significance, and that was where the seed money came for CREATE. It's where money for the bridge came from. And let me just make this comment. I still will never understand how members of Congress can give money to any administration to earmark the money, and we don't do it ourselves. The thing is, the pot of money has been smaller. There is some funding in MAP 21, but not much for projects of national and regional significance. It's something I had pushed for more funding, and it's not there. And that's really where the seed money for these really big projects can come from. Yes.
With respect to the TIFIA money that you had mentioned earlier, are there any limits on how much a particular state can receive?
I don't believe there's any limits on how much a particular state can receive. Ann can correct me if I'm wrong. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there a way for Congress to sort of build in what earmarks did into some program that would allow something similar to occur without having Congress to reauthorize it every time or to pass a bill specifically to authorize funding?
Well, right now, someone is deciding where money is spent. It's always going to be done. Whenever we spend money, someone's going to make the decision. I think the question comes down to who's going to make that decision. We all know even when there were earmarks, most of the funding was allotted by formula to the states, and the states decide where the money is going to be spent. So that still does go on. I just think when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about the mega projects, it's important that there's someone at the national level who's looking at where to spend some of the money. Now, this is still a small portion of the money. So I think you need to have a mega projects fund. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have. Any other questions? Yes.
It seems that there is some agreement, among the leadership at least, that there's a problem with transportation infrastructure. And that, to me, conflicts with the notion that we don't want to spend any money on this problem. So when you talk to your colleagues in the Congress, is there some expectation that the money will come from somewhere else?
I think, like many things, there is, well, first of all, there's a lot of different issues and there's a lot of different views in Congress. First, you have a group of Republicans who really believe this is a state issue, and only a state issue. The problem in Congress now is you start peeling off different groups of people who have an objection for this reason or that reason. So some believe this is just a state issue. We should just get rid of the federal gas tax and send it all back to the states. They say infrastructure, yeah, it's important, but the states should be doing this. Others who just don't want to see any taxes raised, and somehow they believe that the money's going to mysteriously come from somewhere. Don't ask me how, don't ask them how, but they believe it's going to come from somewhere. I also think that there is a sense, and I want to say when we're talking about P3s is, I think P3s have a very important role to play, especially now that we have a lack of public money. But they are never going to replace, to any large extent, public funding for transportation infrastructure. It just is not going to happen. It's not there. There's a reason why roads are right there in the Constitution, that this is something that is a public. Even at the beginning of this country, when there were so many fewer things that governments did, especially the federal government, roads were in there because that was something that was seen as something that was not going to be done if it were not for them being done by the public, that is through the government. But I think there are also some who believe that this can all be done privately. And so once you start peeling away people who have different ideas on how this can or should be done, you don't have a majority who says, okay, we've got to raise user fees, taxes, whatever you want to call it, in some way in order to pay for this.
One more question. No more question? Oh, there's one more question.
Is there a politically palatable way to make this process more efficient, both in terms of the project selection and also in terms of how the projects are actually executed? It seems that over the years, more transportation money has been funneled into worthy but not necessarily core transportation purposes. And the cost of executing our true transportation projects has become extremely high in some cases, in part as a result of the whole federal bidding and procurement process.
Well, I think that there have been issues that certainly everyone has with the way the process works right now, has worked. Projects cost more maybe than they should cost. They, no question, take longer than they should take to get done. And there was some attempt in MAP 21, and I think there will be more in this next bill, to do more to streamline all of this, which will cut down on the time, it will cut down on the cost. I have to say, even when we were working on the bill, however many years ago now, it's hard to remember now, 6 years ago, when we first started working on a reauthorization of safety loop, and Chairman Jim Oberstar had his plan. Jim Oberstar is certainly someone who believes strongly in transportation, but also in what the government has to do. Under that bill that we had, there was a lot of streamlining that was done. So this is not just Republicans saying, oh, we need less government, we need less red tape. This is everybody saying it. Republicans and Democrats saying that things have gone wrong. It's a problem with, a lot of times, not just federal, but especially with federal government, the bureaucracy, the rules, the regulations get to be too much. I think if we really go through a better process this time in coming up with a reauthorization bill, we will do an even better job of cutting through some of that and being able to save that money and get it spent more efficiently on the core transportation infrastructure needs that we have. Thank you.